2 hours, 11 minutes, and 8 seconds, Zulu, USS Harry S. Truman, had 88 seconds before the first Russian torpedo crossed into wake acquisition range. The carrier was on course 164 at 26 knots when Combat Direction Center received the flash report from USS Mason. 2 hostile 533mm torpedoes, bearing 051 relative, range 8,300 yards, running at 47 knots, shallow deep split, both inbound on Truman's starboard quarter. The exact danger was simple. If either weapon entered the carrier's wake inside 2,100 yards, a Nimitz-class hull that large would not turn fast enough to break terminal homing. But the room was already under pressure for a different reason. The lead torpedo was not the full problem. The deeper track was offset 240 yards and lagging by 7 seconds, which meant the visible attack was only the outer layer. 88 seconds remained before the first lethal search gate. 56 seconds remained before Truman's standard evasive turn would place the second torpedo exactly where the Russians wanted it. To understand what was happening, you need to understand what Lieutenant Nora Hale had written 5 hours and 43 minutes earlier, and why her note had been pushed to the edge of the picture instead of the center. Hale was not the strike group commander, not the carrier captain, not the anti-submarine warfare commodore. She was the passive acoustic analysis officer in Mason's undersea warfare cell, a job that usually meant long stretches of filtered noise, uncertain contacts, and reports that mattered only if a quiet problem suddenly turned violent. At 20 hours, 27 minutes, and 14 seconds, Zulu, while Truman's strike group moved southwest in the Norwegian Sea at 22 knots, Mason's TB-37 U towed array picked up a 4.1 second transient below the layer on bearing 044. Hale marked it because the harmonic spacing was wrong for a merchant screw and too stable for biologics. At 20 hours, 51 minutes, and 39 seconds, she logged a second anomaly, a faint pump jet modulation that appeared for 2.6 seconds, disappeared, then returned 11 minutes later, 3 degrees farther south, without the speed scatter expected from civilian traffic. At 21 hours, 33 minutes, and 2 seconds, she added the line that should have made everybody stop. She wrote that the open water sector northeast of the strike group was not acoustically empty. It was masked by a thermal break between 328 and 361 feet, and a submarine sitting below that band could pace the formation with only intermittent exposure to passive sensors unless the screen shifted early and deliberately. What the system believed was happening was not what was actually happening. The common tactical picture showed clean water on the northeast approach and wide maneuver space around the carrier. Hale's logs showed a patient contact using temperature, distance, and the strike group's own confidence as cover. At 22 hours, 18 minutes, and 47 seconds, she filed one more note. This one marked medium confidence, not high confidence, which is exactly why it traveled slower. The contact pattern suggested a submarine that was not positioning for a straight stern shot. It was pacing on a geometry that favored a response shot, meaning the target was not the carrier's current track, but the track the carrier would choose after detection. That seemed theoretical at the time. At 2 hours, 11 minutes, and 8 seconds, it was no longer theoretical. The first problem was visible. The second problem was the one that mattered. Visible problem: 2 Russian torpedoes inbound on a U.S. aircraft carrier. Real problem: the firing submarine had almost certainly modeled the U.S. reaction chain before it ever opened its tubes. Russia did not design the weapon to defeat the defense. Russia designed it to make the defense irrelevant. The lead torpedo was loud enough to be found quickly. The second was deeper, cleaner, and positioned for the maneuver that doctrine would produce. The real danger was somewhere else. Later analysis would assess the shooter as a Yasin M-class submarine operating 17.4 nautical miles off Truman's starboard bow at launch depth 344 feet, speed 6 knots, below the thermal layer and inside a merchant noise corridor. The 2 torpedoes were the same diameter, the same nationality, and the same apparent target, but not the same tactical purpose. One was the trigger, one was the trap. At 2 hours, 11 minutes and 12 seconds, Mason's AN SQQ 89V15 pushed both tracks into the strike group net. At 2 hours, 11 minutes and 15 seconds, the first recommendation came exactly as Russian fire control would have expected. Emergency port turn, full speed, nearest acoustic decoys out, escorts drive hard toward the datum. It was a good answer to a direct shot. This was not a direct shot. At 2 hours, 11 minutes and 18 seconds, Hale asked for 8 seconds before Truman committed to the full turn. She did not ask because she doubted the tracks. She asked because she trusted them too much. The offset between the two weapons was not random. The lead weapon was 38 feet shallower and 240 yards inside the deeper runner, which meant the carrier could dodge the first and still enter the second. On the voice circuit, she said the sentence that changed the entire engagement. They are not tracking the hull. They are tracking the response. At 2 hours, 11 minutes and 21 seconds, nobody in the room liked that sentence, because if Hale was right, then the first move in the defense plan was already poisoned. To understand why the defense was close to failing, you need to understand how little time a carrier group has once a heavyweight torpedo is already inside the final run. At 47 knots, a weapon covers about 79 feet per second. On a big display, 8,300 yards looks manageable. In command time, it is almost nothing. Orders had to move through Truman's Bridge, Mason's undersea warfare team, USS Gettysburg's air defense net, the MH-60R already airborne north of the formation, and the destroyer screen adjusting its own tracks to avoid crossing the carrier's evasive line. Every unnecessary second spent doing the obvious thing gave the hidden thing exactly what it needed. At 2 hours, 11 minutes and 24 seconds, Truman held course 164 for 6 more seconds. That looked reckless if you stared only at the red torpedo symbols. It was the first smart move of the night because it denied the Russian shooter an immediate wake picture. At 2 hours, 11 minutes and 26 seconds, USS Mason streamed AN SLQ 25C Nixie from its port quarter and accelerated from 23 to 31 knots. At 2 hours, 11 minutes and 28 seconds, USS Forrest Sherman angled 039 toward the probable firing bearing. At 2 hours, 11 minutes and 30 seconds, the MH-60R Seahawk callsign Raider 61, already flying a barrier station 10.2 nautical miles northeast of the carrier, was cleared to seed passive sonobuoys without further permission. At 2 hours, 11 minutes and 33 seconds, Hale called out the detail almost nobody else had processed. The time gap between the weapons was 7 seconds, but the lateral separation was increasing too slowly for a simple bracket. That meant at least one torpedo was likely still under wire guidance, waiting for Truman to make the big clean turn that every tactical manual would recommend. What the system believed was happening was not what was actually happening. The strike group thought it was watching 2 attacks. Hale thought it was watching 1 attack and 1 steering command. At 2 hours, 11 minutes and 36 seconds, the strike group commander ordered Truman to maintain 26 knots for another 9 seconds, then execute a controlled port shift of 18 degrees instead of the full emergency brake turn already cued on the bridge. If Hale was wrong, the carrier would lose angle and precious distance. If Hale was right, the Russian submarine would guide one of its 2 weapons into empty water. At 2 hours, 11 minutes and 40 seconds, Raider 61 dropped 2 AN SSQ 53G Difar sonobuoys along bearing 046, separated by 1.9 nautical miles. At 2 hours, 11 minutes and 43 seconds, Forrest Sherman prepared 1 Rum 139 VL ASROC for immediate launch the moment it had a usable submarine datum. That was the first ruthless decision of the response. The strike group was no longer focused only on surviving the torpedoes. It was trying to break the submarine's control loop before the weapons reached terminal search. At 2 hours, 11 minutes and 47 seconds, Truman started the 18-degree port shift. At 2 hours, 11 minutes and 49 seconds, Mason increased Nixie output and crossed wider to thicken the false acoustic corridor. At 2 hours, 11 minutes and 52 seconds, The lead torpedo bent 6 degrees toward the decoy line. At 2 hours, 11 minutes and 54 seconds, the second torpedo did not follow. It stayed deeper and cleaner on a line that made sense only if it expected Truman to continue turning hard into a long, predictable wake arc. The first problem was visible. The second problem was the one that mattered. At 2 hours, 11 minutes and 57 seconds, Raider 61 dropped one ANSSQ 62F die-cast buoy and pulsed active for 3.5 seconds. The return came back weak, then vanished. A rush team could have called it clutter. Hale said no. A contact that disappears exactly when active energy arrives is often a submarine changing aspect and trying to hide behind the layer. The real danger was somewhere else, and now it had just twitched. At 2 hours, 12 minutes and 1 seconds, Forrest Sherman launched its first VL ASROC on bearing 047, range 16,200 yards. Not because the solution was perfect, but because the submarine had to be forced to react. At 2 hours, 12 minutes and 5 seconds, the lead torpedo entered terminal acquisition, 2,280 yards off Truman's starboard quarter. At 2 hours, 12 minutes and 7 seconds, Mason's Nixie transmission strengthened. At 2 hours, 12 minutes and 10 seconds, the lead weapon shifted another 9 degrees toward the decoy. At 2 hours, 12 minutes and 13 seconds, the second torpedo remained on the deeper intercept line. That was the moment the room understood the trap in full. One weapon had been offered to the defense. The second had been reserved for the defense's own maneuver. The visible attack was only the outer layer. At 2 hours, 12 minutes and 16 seconds, Hale recommended a second move that sounded wrong to nearly everybody except the people who had fully accepted the geometry. She told the bridge not to widen the port turn. She told them to stop it early, hold for 11 seconds, then shift 9 degrees back to starboard. A normal crew under torpedo attack wants more turn, more speed, more separation. Hale wanted less. She wanted the carrier to produce a broken wake line instead of the large, clean curve the Russian fire control team had almost certainly built into the shot. At 2 hours, 12 minutes and 19 seconds, Truman steadied on heading 146. At 2 hours, 12 minutes and 21 seconds, the bridge kept speed at 27 knots. At 2 hours, 12 minutes and 23 seconds, the first ASROC delivered Nuke 54 splashed near the estimated submarine datum. At 2 hours, 12 minutes and 25 seconds, Raider 61 heard exactly what Hale needed to hear. A short broadband transient, followed by a fast depth change. The Russian submarine had maneuvered. That meant wire guidance was broken or at least degraded. The response was starting to work, but only if the carrier survived the next 33 seconds. At 2 hours, 12 minutes and 28 seconds, the lead torpedo detonated on Mason's decoy corridor at a missed distance later assessed at 2,410 yards from Truman and 410 yards from Mason, no U.S. ship was hit. The loud problem was gone. The quiet problem was still inbound. At 2 hours, 12 minutes and 31 seconds, the second torpedo descended another 8 feet and corrected left by 4 degrees. It was still searching for the wake line Russian doctrine expected. At 2 hours, 12 minutes and 34 seconds, Truman held steady. That was the most disciplined second of the entire engagement. The system believed the carrier should keep turning. Hale understood that a continuous arc would rebuild the exact wake the second torpedo needed to lock. At 2 hours, 12 minutes and 39 seconds, Truman executed the planned 9-degree starboard correction. Total net offset now broken into 2 smaller maneuvers instead of 1 clean escape pattern. At 2 hours, 12 minutes and 42 seconds, the second torpedo crossed the position where the Russian shooter had likely placed the carrier's wake after a textbook hard port turn. Nothing useful was there. At 2 hours, 12 minutes and 45 seconds, the weapon widened its search basket. That search pattern was its death sentence because it increased dwell time inside the decoy-rich sector and confirmed it had lost the geometry that mattered. At 2 hours, 12 minutes and 48 seconds, Mason adjusted Nixie heading 12 degrees. At 2 hours, 12 minutes and 50 seconds, the second torpedo shifted 8 degrees toward the false acoustic line. At 2 hours 12 minutes and 53 seconds, it passed 590 yards astern of Truman without acquiring the carrier's wake. At 2 hours 12 minutes and 56 seconds, it detonated on the decoy return 1,070 yards behind the ship. Both Russian torpedoes were finished. Truman was still moving. All 5,112 personnel aboard the carrier were alive, but Hale had already moved to the next problem, because surviving a shot is not the same thing as ending the threat. What the system believed was happening was not what was actually happening. The tactical display now suggested a defensive success. Hale saw a 7-4 second window to kill the shooter before it recovered enough control to slip back below the layer and disappear. At 2 hours 12 minutes and 59 seconds, Raider 61 dropped a second die-cast buoy 1,300 yards southeast of the first active return. At 2 hours 13 minutes and 3 seconds, the buoy held a stronger contact at depth 417 feet, speed 15 knots, bearing drift 5 degrees right. The Yasin was moving now. That was a forced mistake. A quiet submarine survives by staying disciplined. Once it accelerates beneath active and passive triangulation, silence stops protecting it. At 2 hours 13 minutes and 7 seconds, Forrest Sherman received a cleaner firing solution. At 2 hours 13 minutes and 10 seconds, it launched a second VL Asrock. At 2 hours 13 minutes and 13 seconds, Raider 61 rolled into attack and dropped its first air-launched Merca 54 from 600 feet and 132 knots. The U.S. response was no longer just defensive. It was structured violence aimed at collapsing the submarine's escape options one by one. To understand why the Russian boat failed next, you need to understand what Hale had actually been tracking all evening. She was not following a single sound. She was following a behavior pattern. The submarine had used the thermal layer as a shield, merchant traffic as camouflage, a loud lead torpedo as bait, and American doctrine as part of its firing solution. That told her something about the captain on the other side. He was technically confident, patient, and committed to a prepared geometry. Officers like that usually trust their planned escape lane too long. Hale believed the submarine would not break west into noisier water near the merchant corridor. It would break north-northeast into colder, deeper water where acoustic conditions improved, and NATO air coverage would arrive 4 to 6 minutes later. At 2 hours 13 minutes and 18 seconds, while reports of the second torpedo's detonation were still moving through the net, Hale pushed a predicted escape line on bearing 029 with a 2-4 nautical mile uncertainty box. That single overlay changed the counterattack from pursuit into ambush. At 2 hours 13 minutes and 22 seconds, Raider 61 laid 3 AN SSQ 53G buoys along that track. At 2 hours 13 minutes and 27 seconds, the center buoy heard an acceleration transient followed by an abrupt reduction in screw rate as the submarine tried to go quiet again. It was too late. Once the contact had 3 points, it no longer had ocean, it had math. At 2 hours 13 minutes and 31 seconds, the first Mk-54 went active. At 2 hours 13 minutes and 34 seconds, the Russian submarine ejected acoustic decoys and altered course 17 degrees. At 2 hours 13 minutes and 38 seconds, the second Asrock delivered Mach 54 entered the water 1,000 yards ahead of the projected escape line. At 2 hours 13 minutes and 42 seconds, Hale identified the Russian countermeasures as countermeasures because the broadband return was too uniform and the turn timing was too clean. A real submarine under sudden pressure never sounds perfectly balanced. Machines do. That judgment stopped the U.S. team from wasting its kill window on the wrong target. The visible counterattack could have become another trap if they had fired themselves stupid. At 2 hours 13 minutes and 47 seconds, Raider 61 shifted active focus to the weaker, dirtier return under the layer. At 2 hours 13 minutes and 51 seconds, the first Mk-54 corrected 11 degrees right. At 2 hours 13 minutes and 55 seconds, the submarine made a hard depth change from 417 feet to 468 feet. That single move told Hale the Russian captain had lost the comfortable layer that had protected him since first contact. He was reacting now, not planning. At 2 hours, 13 minutes and 59 seconds, the second Merc 54 acquired. At 2 hours, 14 minutes and 3 seconds, Raider 61 reported transient cavitation, followed by a heavy metallic impulse. That was the first hit. It struck aft near propulsion spaces, not enough to break the hull immediately, but enough to cut speed and punish maneuver. At 2 hours, 14 minutes and 7 seconds, the contact slowed from 15 knots to 6 knots. At 2 hours, 14 minutes and 10 seconds, Forrest Sherman obtained an updated fix. At 2 hours, 14 minutes and 13 seconds, Mason turned 7 degrees to maintain a clean attack lane if a third shot became necessary. At 2 hours, 14 minutes and 16 seconds, Hale advised against waiting for full damage assessment. A damaged Yasin M with surviving systems could still dump decoys, fire another countermeasure pattern, or sink into bottom clutter long enough to survive. The response had to stay ruthless because a submarine that had just fired 2 heavyweight torpedoes at a U.S. aircraft carrier was not a contact to observe. It was a contact to finish. At 2 hours, 14 minutes and 20 seconds, Raider 61 dropped its second Mk-54. At 2 hours, 14 minutes and 24 seconds, the torpedo went active. At 2 hours, 14 minutes and 28 seconds, the Russian submarine attempted one final port turn, likely trying to hide its damaged stern from the inbound weapon. That maneuver widened the acoustic return and made targeting easier. At 2 hours, 14 minutes and 32 seconds, the second air-launched Mk-54 detonated beneath the contact. The hydrophone record later showed a short pressure spike, then a hull break impulse 1.2 seconds later. At 2 hours, 14 minutes and 36 seconds, the main return split into 3 separate contacts and stopped moving as a single body. At 2 hours, 14 minutes and 43 seconds, the strike group assessed the firing submarine as catastrophically disabled. At 2 hours, 15 minutes and 2 seconds, a P-8, a Poseidon redirected from Keflavik, entered the outer box to confirm the debris field and search for survivors. None were found. The Russian plan had been precise. It was not a random shot. It was a control shot designed to do 3 things at once: drive a U.S. carrier into a predicted evasive turn, use that turn to deliver the second torpedo where the first could not, and prove that a submarine below the layer could make the most heavily protected ship in the formation react on Russian timing. That plan failed for one reason. Hale refused to read the attack the way the attacker wanted it read. Truman survived. Its reactors survived. Its flight deck survived. Its embarked air wing survived. Mason survived. Forrest Sherman survived. Gettysburg survived. U.S. casualties were 0 killed and 0 wounded. Both Russian torpedoes were defeated. The Yasin M that fired them was destroyed below the layer, with 64 crew presumed lost. The retaliation fit the offense exactly. Russia had tried to turn American doctrine into damage. The United States turned Russian geometry into a coffin. And the hard truth at the end of the report was not about tonnage, missiles, or prestige. It was that the carrier was still moving at 2:15 because Nora Hale noticed 3 wrong sounds, wrote them down, and refused to let the water lie for Russia.